It was without a doubt the strangest day in the man's life. Like most days that turn out to be extraordinary, this one started out to be very normal. He woke up at the normal time, followed his same normal morning routine. He and his father took the same walk they did every day, the same route to the same destination. And when they arrived, his father said the same prayer over him that he did every day, and then left him to his work. They called it work, but that was more of an inside joke because in reality, he was a beggar. He'd been born blind at birth, and it was the only life that he knew. Every day, his father led him down to the temple complex where he set up shop near the money changers. That way, no one could say they didn't have something to give. And he sat there every day, all day long, until his father came to pick him up and lead him home again. And this day started like all of the other days until he heard someone say, "Rabbi, who sinned? Was it this man or his parents that he was born blind?" He hated when they did that, when they talked about him like he wasn't even there. It's almost as if they thought he was deaf as well as blind. They treated him like an object more than a person. There's the tree, there's the sheep, there's the doors that lead to the inner rooms of the temple. There's the blind guy. Among them, yes, but never one of them. Always on the outside, never fully alive. And that's when things got weird, because he sensed someone kneel down in front of him. That never happened. If anyone acknowledged him at all, it was to simply throw a few coins in his direction, but this person actually stooped down to his level. He heard the person spit and braced for what he was certain was going to come next. But instead of spit hitting his face, what he felt was some gooey, paste-like substance being smeared across his eyes. The man flushed with anger. He knew it. It was a cruel joke. Ha, 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 very funny. Let's put something over the blind man's eyes. But then a voice spoke. And it wasn't cruel, and it wasn't malicious. But instead, it was quiet and yet strong, firm and yet inviting. The voice said, "Go, wash in the pool of the sent ones." And so the man did. And as he splashed water on his face and started to rub his eyes, the most incredible thing happened. He began to see. At first, it hurt. He didn't quite know what was happening, but then he started seeing objects and colors. He could see the light dancing off the water. He could see the blue sky. He saw 1,000 different colors in the marketplace, shades of purple and green and red. He saw animals for the first time, a bird soaring over the temple, and he thought to himself, well, I guess that's what a sheep looks like. But best of all were the people. So many people, so many faces looking back at him. He laughed, and then he cried, and then he simply praised God. Because after a lifetime of being in the darkness, of being on the outside and never fully a part of the community, he could finally live. He might be able to get a job, a real job. He might be able to have his own home, a family, a wife, and children. He could finally be fully alive. The people, the crowds around him, simply stared. It was obvious the man was going through something. And then someone recognized him. They said, "Isn't that the blind beggar?" And others said, "No. He told the story more times than he could remember, and it was as straightforward as it was incredible. The man called Jesus, put mud on his eyes, told him to wash, and now he could see. And all the commotion had attracted the attention of the temple guards, and they quickly came and shuttled the man off through the doors into the inner rooms of the temple to go and talk to the Pharisees. And there, the questions continued. The same questions over and over and over again. They asked him. They asked each other. They even called in his parents and asked them. And the more questions they asked, the more angry they became because the answers never changed. Jesus had given this man back his sight. Jesus had opened for him a whole new life. And they didn't want to hear that. And so they threw him out. Literally, they had the guards grab him by the arms and half carry, half drag him to the doors, and they threw him into the street like a bouncer at a nightclub. And there, sitting in the dust and the dirt again, he heard the door slam behind him and the locking bar come down. And once again, he was on the outside, expelled from the temple, from the community, from his family. Just when he thought the door to life had finally opened for him, it was slammed in his face. That's the story that John tells us just before our reading, just before the words that Jesus speaks. John recounts how Jesus had restored the sight of a man born blind, a man who would have been on the outside, on the fringes of society his entire life, and how that man was then kicked out again by the Pharisees. And yet Jesus went looking for him. And in the ensuing conversation, Jesus says this. We've read these words a couple times. I invite you to read them with me again. Jesus says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved. He will go in and out and find pastures." Jesus says, "I am the door." Of all the I am statements that we've looked at so far, I think that in some ways this one might be the most straightforward. Because you all understand doors. You've operated them. You've gone into doors. You've gone out of doors. You've opened them. You've closed them. You've gone through them. You're familiar with doors. You get it. And yet Jesus doesn't give us a whole lot of detail as to what he's talking about when he says, "I am the door." He doesn't tell us how he is a door. In fact, most of John chapter 10 is filled with talk about sheep and shepherds and thieves and robbers and following Jesus' voice. And we'll get to all of that next week when we talk about Jesus as the good shepherd. But today, first, we ask, what does Jesus mean when he says, "I am the door"? In the immediate context, Jesus is talking about the door to a sheep pen. This would have been a familiar image to the people listening to Jesus that day. In the ancient Near East, shepherds who were out in the field with their flocks, they had this practice of creating enclosures for the sheep, especially if they were going to be overnight out in the field. And so they would grab rocks and limbs and branches and brush and whatever really they could find and kind of make this enclosure with just one opening, only one way in and one way out. And then the shepherd would position himself right in that doorway. And so you can kind of see a picture of what it might have looked like there, all the brush in a circle. The sheep would be on the inside, and there's that one opening, and that's where the shepherd would lie down. That's where the shepherd would sleep and spend the night, with the result being that anything or anyone trying to get in or out of the enclosure would have to go through him, would have to go through the shepherd. And it's in the presence of a man who had just had the door slammed in his face. And in the presence of those who had done the slamming, the religious authorities who thought they were the ones, they were the gatekeepers who got to decide who was in and who was out with respect to God's people. It's in the presence of these individuals that Jesus says, no. You've got it all wrong. I'm the door. I am the only way to the Father. I am the only door to a full and abundant life. Of course, you know what it's like to be on the outside. I have a door shut in your face. I imagine every one of us here has a story about what it feels like to be excluded or when they felt like you didn't quite belong. And my sense is that this fear of being left on the outside looking in is at the root of so much of the worry and anxiety and fear that we experience as we all kind of together try to navigate this changing societal landscape. Long-held institutions, things that we thought were a sure thing, are all in flux. And you could probably name them with me. Education, technology, business, politics, family structure. The list goes on and on and on. Everything, it seems, is changing. Everything is up for grabs, and it's happening very, very quickly. And so perhaps you worry that once all of the dust settles and once the new normal is finally established, you'll be on the outside. That the door to a good and prosperous life will be closed to you. And for some, maybe even some of you, this claim of Jesus to be the door, to be the only way to the Father, the only way to a full life, this statement that Jesus makes is equally troubling, even offensive. How can you say Jesus is the only way? Isn't that narrow-minded? Isn't that even exclusive? What about all those other people? Good people, my friend, my brother, my neighbor, my classmate, people who are genuinely kind and caring, who are sincerely seeking after God and doing their best. What about them? Even if they go another way. And if you've ever asked that question, that means you get what Jesus is talking about, at least in part. Because when Jesus says, I am the door, it is in a way incredibly exclusive. Jesus is the only access point. He's the only way to the Father. Jesus is the only source of life. Jesus is the only door. That's true. But here's the thing. Being exclusive about Jesus as the only door to life is the only way to be inclusive about who gets to come in. Being exclusive about Jesus as the only door to eternal life is the only way to be inclusive about who gets to come in. It is because of Jesus that the door is open to you. Unlike the door that the Pharisees closed in the face of the blind man, or the doors that you have had closed in your face, or all the other social and religious schemes and schematics that decide who is in, who is out, who is good, who is not, who is welcome through the door, and who has the door shut in their face. In contrast to all of that, the door is open to you. Because none of us is good enough. None of us has the right credentials. None of us would be in on our own. And so Jesus does it for you. He does it for you, and he does it for you, and for you, and for you, and for you, and he does it for me. Jesus opens the door for the blind man and for the Pharisee. He opens the door for those who have been lifelong disciples and for those who are avowed non-believers. He opens the door for those whose sins are open and public and those whose sins are private and hidden, known only to God and themselves. He opens the door for bears and for puppies and for robbers and even for Pastor Jeff too. He opens the door for every skin color, every net worth, every intelligence level, every age, and every other differentiating factor that you can imagine. His life for yours. His death for yours. Jesus says, whoever, as many as enter through me, will be saved. Because of Jesus, the door is open to you. And you'll notice that it's a two-way door. There's a rhythm to this life that Jesus offers. He says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. In and out. Many of you have been regaled with stories from Pastor Jeff's sabbatical. And so you might have heard the one about his week with the Norbert Teens monks in New Mexico. The Norbert Teens are named after St. Norbert. I didn't even know there was a St. Norbert, but there was a St. Norbert at one point, and they are a 900-year-old order of the Catholic Church. And what makes the Norbert Teens distinct is that, like you and me, they have jobs out in the community. They live together in a monastery or an abbey. And kind of like what we might normally think of for nuns and monks and those who follow a Catholic religious order, they live together, but in the morning they go out into the community to serve in dozens of different vocations, counselor, pastor, teacher, all sorts of different things. The Norbert Teens follow Jesus by living together and praying together and eating together in the abbey or the monastery. And they follow Jesus by going out into the community and the neighborhood to serve others in his name. It sounds a lot like Loved and Sent, doesn't it? Better than that, it sounds a lot like Jesus. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. And so this week, I want you to live like a monk. When you leave the building today or tomorrow morning, when you leave your home and you go through the door, remember, Jesus is the door. Jesus is the one who leads you out, who sends you out into the world to important work, to serve others in his name. And when you come back home and put your key in the lock or turn the knob, remember, Jesus is the door. It is only through Jesus that you and I receive abundant life. Kind of like going from being a blind beggar into a world full of color and movement and vibrancy. Jesus is the door, and the door is open to you. Amen.